Hello. So today we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 19, and this is around verses 6 and 7. So what has happened is King David, his son Absalom turned against him and basically had split the kingdom up and tried to take over the whole kingdom, and David's people went to war against Absalom's people. And David gave the order to his men not to kill Absalom, but they didn't. I don't remember if they didn't get the word or they just disobeyed the order. But Absalom was killed in battle by David's people, and David was completely distraught and just beside himself with grief. And but his men had won the battle. They killed Absalom, who was the leader of the opposing forces, and then therefore won the battle and were on the verge of combining the kingdom back into one Israel instead of continuing with this civil war. And but David was completely beside himself and just distraught. And in this passage in 2 Samuel, this is Joab, who is David's general, basically. He led David's forces. He's telling David here, get hold of yourself, get out there and put some heart into your servants. I swear to God that if you don't go to them, they'll desert, and not another soldier will be left here by nightfall. So what had happened is the soldiers, the men, had heard that David was distraught, even though they had gone out and given everything, fought as hard as they could, and they won the battle. They came back, and their king's disappointed in them. Their king is beside himself with grief, which is understandable. It was his son. But the interesting thing here is that Joab is saying, you got to get out there and you got to build up your men, because if you don't, they're going to desert you and you're going to have nothing. So there's some really good leadership lessons here, both from David and from Joab. First of all, start with David. David had developed a culture within his leadership circle that his leaders could come to him and tell him things without fear. Remember the situation. David's son, whom he loved, had just been killed and he was grieving, but Joab still had the freedom to come up and say, you got to straighten yourself out. David was the king. He could have had him killed in a second. But David had developed a culture, and even in his worst moment, stuck to that culture where he would listen to his leaders. And so that's the first leadership lesson. David built a culture where his leaders could come and tell him the truth, and he would listen. And the second is from Joab. He was a good enough leader to take advantage of what David had developed. He wasn't afraid to go and tell David, even though he was the king, he wasn't afraid to tell David what the truth of the matter was. And he did that because David needed to hear it. If David didn't hear this, it would have been bad for David. It would have been bad for the kingdom. So first of all, Joab wasn't afraid to go tell his boss what the situation was. And second of all, he was looking out for his boss. He was making sure that his king was making the right decisions for him personally and as well as for the kingdom. So he kept the big picture in mind, and then he went and said what needed to be said. So we can learn from that, and we can do those things ourselves. Any organization that we might be a leader in, we have to develop a culture that allows people to come to us and say, hey boss, this is what I'm seeing, and this is what I think needs to happen. If we're relying 100% on our own knowledge and our own experience, we're going to fail. We've got to have a culture where the people that we're leading can come and speak to us freely. And second of all, for those leaders above us, we need to be sure that we're looking out for our boss. We need to make sure that we are not afraid to go and tell our boss what he needs to hear, even if it's hard to say, even if the timing might not be the best, but it's urgent. We have to first of all be aware of what's going on and looking at the bigger picture ourselves so that we can watch out for our bosses and then go and tell them what the situation is and what we suggest needs to happen. So from two different perspectives, this is a good leadership story, from the leader's perspective and then from the follower's perspective. So hope you enjoyed that. Have a good day.